Helen Thomas and the CDFM study group. Today's session we're going to be reviewing an overall wrap-up of CDFM Module 2 from the 2020 study guide. So if you remember my recommendation when you first begin your studies, you need to ensure that you are reviewing everything on each of the pages. So when you come to the study group, you have to already have bought your CDFM study guides from ASMC, and then we'll go through the materials together. I do not go over everything on the pages because that is your opportunity to review. I have a limited amount of time, so I just kind of focus on certain things on each pages. So when you first get the material, it is important for you to go through every page as I mentioned. Then you make notes. You go back the second time you read through the same material, you make notes off to the side of the important things. Highlighters are good. Anybody will tell you I love bright colors, but highlighting the material alone will not get you to understand the material or be able to pinpoint it when necessary. It's important for you to use pen and paper and for you to write to the sides. For those of us who have trouble taking exams, it's important to study this way. So when you study the second round of going through the material, you write off to the side the important things on that page. Then the third time you go through the material, you are focusing on the important things under that topic. So you should at least go through the materials 3 to 4 times before we get to today. So today's session is more of a rapid fire. I'll start off going in order, but then I'm going to be going different modules, different competency areas, different sections. Some of the material for Module 1 and 3 does overlap with Module 2. So it requires me to go over that material. Another reminder is that on the exams will not be broken down by competency areas. The questions are not going to say, well, they come from Module 2, Competency 2, or Competency 1. Based on the question being asked, you will then have to determine what's the best answer. All right, I need my eyepiece here. All right, there we go. Now I can see. All right, so we're going to begin with Module 2, as I mentioned, for today. And then so today will be the part 1. And then next week, we will wrap up with the review. By the time you get to the review, you should be familiar with a lot of the things that I'm going to go over this morning. All right, so let us begin. So I'm going to start off Module 2.1. Understanding the mission of the Department of Defense to provide the forces necessary to provide safety and security. But then in order for them to provide security and safety, you need funding, you need personnel, you need a budget, you need all kind of resources. So that's what we're talking about here, is all the resources necessary to help those combatant commanders meet their broadening mission. All right, so the Department of Defense have several agencies, several military forces, Army, Navy, Marine, Air Force, and the newest one that was established in 2019 is the Space Force, which falls under the Air Force. So Space Force is one of the newest forces that was created under the Department of Defense. All right. When it comes to, so we said, let's look at hierarchy. You got your president, who's the commander-in-chief. You have your Secretary of Defense, who's also civilian, just like your president. And then you have your top military folks, are your chiefs of staff, Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in 1986, the Goldwater-Nichols Act identified a chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to tie in all the resources and the requirements for the entire military. So that also tells me prior to 1986, they did not have one spokesperson. The Army chief spoke, Navy chief spoke, and so forth. So it wasn't until the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 that identified the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff as the senior military advisor to whom? To the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. Okay, so who makes up the National Security Council? The primary members are President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Secretary of Energy, and Secretary of the Treasury. The two advisors are the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Director of National Intelligence. Okay, so we're talking about NSC, National Security Council. That's the President's senior forum for determining the country strategy. What is the name of the document produced by the National Security Council? It is the National Security Strategy. That's our big operation order, the NSS document. That's the country's operation order. Since we're DOD and Department of Defense, we all should know what an operation order is. So what do you typically do with an operation order? You get it, you look at it page by page to see what is required of your organization, what you need to be able to do to meet the national security strategy. So the Department of Defense does that. They look at the national security strategy to determine what are the defense-related actions that need to be taken. So you got your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, and he has his staff. He has a vice chairman. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff has several roles. See, all I'm doing is flipping the pages, and I'm regurgitating what's on that page. And I'm not going to tell you what page, because when you review at this point, the information should become clearer to you. All right, so the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, who works hand in hand with the chairman, he is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. Why is that important? Remember, what are the three DOD support systems? The three systems that the Department of Defense operates under: JCITS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. Those are the three overarching systems. All three of them overlap to meet the National Defense Strategy. And the National Defense Strategy meets the National Security Strategy. See, it all syncs together. Stay with me. So the vice chairman is in charge of the JCITS process, the first one I talked about. And he has the Joint Requirements Oversight Council to help him, or her, whoever's in that position. And then the vice chairman also sits under the Defense Acquisition System, the third system. What does he do there? He helps to tie in with the acquisition side of the house to ensure that we are still meeting the National Defense Strategy. So the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the co-chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board. Combatant commanders. Why are they important? They are important because if you go back to the mission of the Department of Defense to provide these forces, well, if I provide forces, how do I provide them? How do I provide that security? I need combatant commanders to do so. So combatant commanders are responsible for various regions of the map, of the globe. Right? You got NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, Indo-Pacific, Central, AFRICOM, a whole bunch of them. We went over 11 of them in the study guide. So, operational chain of command. The importance of the resources goes to those combatant command. Why? Because they're the ones actually doing the Department of Defense mission. So operational chain of command runs from the commander-in-chief, the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders. Communication to the combatant commanders typically happens through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Let me repeat that. Remember, you got your president, your SecDef, your combatant commanders. That is the operational chain of command. However, your president and your SecDef are civilians. Your combatant commanders are military. So to tie those two together, you have the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff communicating translating the civilian verbiage to the military verbiage to the combatant commanders so that the orders of the president is understood and executed. So operational chain of command runs from the president to the SecDef to the combatant commanders. Communication through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. All right. So we said that the Department of Defense takes the national security strategy and develops the national defense strategy. Part of the defense strategy is to determine what the military capabilities are, what the military strategy needs to be, what exactly needs to be done. So understand that part of the national defense strategy, you have the national military strategy. And in the event that you are asked who is the author of the national military strategy, it makes sense that the top military person is the one that signs it, that approves it, that creates it, which is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, is the creator, is the developer of the national military strategy. So even though he advises, we do not get fiscal or policy guidance directly from the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. We get it from the Secretary of Defense. Also part of the national defense strategy, you have the strategy for homeland defense. We also got to defend our own, defend our own country. I got stuck on words, forgive me. All right. And so we say the three DoD support systems again were JCITS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, Planning, Programming, Budgeting and Execution, PPBE, and DAS, or the Defense Acquisition System. So part of the JCITS process is to identify capability gaps. So if we know in the National Defense Strategy, we need to be able to complete a specific mission. Now we need to look at the resources. So in the JCITS process, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who all make up the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, they then have to look at the requirements and determine our capabilities. What do we have, and what capability gaps do we have to meet that national defense strategy? And so part of that analytical process is for them to look at the .MLPF, acronym that stands for doctrine, organization, training, material, leader, development, education, personnel, and facilities, .MLPF. So they look in each one of those areas to determine where the capability gap lies. If the capability gap lies in any one of them other than material, it only triggers the PPBE process. We need to go to planning, we need to request funding from Congress and the programs from Congress, PPBE process. If the solution to fill that capability gap for that warfighter is a material solution, an aircraft, a vehicle, a DoD support system, if it's a material solution, it's a thing, a major end item thing that's going to solve that problem, then it triggers the defense acquisition system. The JCITS process goes through so learn them in the order: JCITS, PPBE, defense acquisition system. JCITS is doing the analytical studies of the .MLPF, doctrine, organization, material, leader development, education, facilities, all of that. And then once they determine, okay, well, it's going to take, we need some up-armored Humvee with GPS that flies. Okay, that's going to trigger, it's a material solution, so it's going to trigger the acquisition system. If it's, we need additional personnel, we need additional funding from Congress, it's going to trigger the PPBE process. So that's how you tell the difference there. So that's JSIDS and who's in charge. Planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. At the DoD level, we need to know who is in charge, who being the title of the individual in charge of that process. So the planning phase, let me get caught up here. All right, so the planning phase of PEEB, who's in charge of it? The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is in charge of the planning, right? Planning, a lot of documents, policy person, makes sense, kind of tie it together. Planning, programming. Programming is the responsibility of the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, DK. Budgeting is the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. USD Comptroller is in charge of the budgeting and execution phase of PEEB. Also, when you come to the acquisition side, you also need to know who's in charge of the defense acquisition system. It is the Undersecretary of Defense, ANS, Acquisition and Sustainment. And that is a new title. So in the older study guide, I think it was USD AT&L, Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. Now that title is USD ANS, Acquisition and Sustainment. That is the individual that is in charge of the defense acquisition system. That is the individual in charge of the defense, is a chairman of the Defense Acquisition Board, and also the same individual who is a co-chairman with the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff I just talked about before. So if you listen to me and what I've been talking about the last, 30 minutes or so, or less, the reason the Module 2 becomes difficult for some is being able to do what I just did. So you have to know your hierarchy, and you have to know who works where, what do they do. So I always say get you a blank sheet of paper, write it out. Because at the DoD level, for each of the systems, you need to know who is in charge of those systems and how they overlap. Remember I told you, and if you look in the study guide, those 3 circles overlap at different areas because all 3 of them need to be in sync to meet the National Defense Strategy, and the National Defense Strategy must meet the National Security Strategy. All right, stay with me. All right, so we talked about all of this, all of that, policy guide. What you also need to know at the PPBE process, what is the name of the database that's being updated in the PPBE process? FYDP, or Future Year Defense Program. That is the DoD database. That is the responsibility of the DCAPE. The same person in charge of programming is also in charge of updating the Future Year Defense Program. So the FYDP, as they move through the PPBE process, the FYDP is being updated. It is a DoD database that ties together the appropriations, the mission, the various sources, or Army, Navy, Air Force, DoD personnel that utilizes those appropriations. So you have FYDP and programming phase of PEEB for the DK. You have budget and execution for the USD Comptroller. In the budgeting phase of PEEB, there was an additional system that must be updated on the budgeting side. And that system is called the Comptroller Information System. So I'm trying to pause so in case you're listening or you're reviewing these videos later, it'll give you an opportunity to try to guess the answers. So CIS, Comptroller Information System. All right, so what is the final document at the end of the program, the planning phase? That's the defense planning guidance. What is the final document at the programming phase? That is the program decision memorandum. And the final document at the budgeting phase is the program budget decision, right? Because they got the word budget, so I kind of emphasize that. So make sure you know the final documents in each phase. And then the execution phase, what is the final document that gives you funding? It is the appropriation law or the Appropriation Act. So we said the JROC we talked about. When is the president required to submit the budget request to Congress? According to the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, it says that the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. It doesn't say it cannot be submitted before, but it must not be no later than the first Monday in February. All right, so think about the budget process. And in Module 2, it does not go into as much details as it does in Module 1. So you may want to review Module 1 so that you can see the congressional action once the president submits the budget. So I'm going to kind of briefly go through these. All right, so once the president submits the budget to Congress to say, hey, this is what we want for FY23, since we're on the embarking. So for FY23, that particular request then has to be reviewed by member House and Senate. Congress is broken down by House and Senate. So you have a different House and a different Senate responsible for each congressional action. The first congressional action is a concurrent budget resolution. What does that mean? Concurrent is telling you it's the same thing going on for both sides of Congress. What are they doing? What they're doing is they're getting information from the Congressional Budget Office, from GAO, wherever, to show what our budget was for previous years, what was our deficit, what's our surplus, did we have, what are the numbers. Before we look at the president budget, what are the current numbers? And then in the concurrent budget resolution, what they're also determining is what guidelines will be used to review the pres budget. So that is the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee responsible for that. The second phase of congressional action is the authorization process. You have a different House and a different Senate that's responsible for the congressional authorization process. What is the purpose of the authorization process? To authorize the programs, the category of things we are allowed to do for that upcoming fiscal year. Even if funding is listed in the authorization program, it does not give us budget authority. So when it becomes law, it does not give us budget authority. And now I kind of triggered the authorization and the appropriation. Both of those have to go to the president for the president to sign for them to become law. The concurrent budget resolution is an internal process in Congress, so it does not go to the president for signature. That's them just agreeing what stipulations, what guidelines they're going to review, the pres budget. All right, so let's go back to authorization. So once the president submits the budget, then it also has to go to the authorizers to authorize the category of things we are allowed to do. Some of them may lists funding, but that's not important, irrelevant. Does not give us budget authority. So that is the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee are responsible for the authorization process. Then the third congressional action after the president submits the budget is the congressional appropriations process. The appropriators, so you have your House Appropriation Committee and your Senate Appropriation Committee. And so in Module 1, if you review it, it'll go through what happens when it gets to Congress in each one of these. So on the House side and the Senate side, they're looking at the same document. They're making their marks. They're deciding what they agree with, what they don't. And then at some point, the two have to meet in the middle to determine what similarities they have, but most of all, what are the differences. When the two sides come together, that is a conference committee or the third chamber. So the House and the Senate has to come together. They have to agree on what the overall bill is or the proposal that needs to go to the president to become law. So once the president signs it, it becomes law. Then we have an appropriation act or an appropriation law. Appeals can be made to Congress to change or to request a change for whatever is approved. But the bottom line is with the 12 appropriations is they are approved in the appropriation process by the House Appropriation Committee and the Senate Appropriation Committee. Then that is what triggers the execution process of PPBE. Once that appropriation law is in effect. So in the execution phase, after Congress appropriates, two things happen. What are those two things? The two things that happen, one, the legal part of it is the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant. The second part of it is OMB begins the apportionment process. So Congress appropriate, triggers the Treasury warrant, and OMB begins the apportionment process. How does the apportionment process work? Once Congress appropriates, the agencies, that is your DOD, Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of State, they must complete an SF-132 apportionment document and submit it to OMB within 10 days requesting their appropriation. So it's like your parent says, yes, your dad says, I'm going to give you $20 to go to the movies. Get it from your mother. And then you go to your mother and you say, hey, dad said I can get $20 from you. And then based on her checking with dad, then she'll say, okay, here you go. Here's a 20 that dad promised you. So it's a similar scenario. I hate to use it as such, but it's easy as a parent to do it that way. Because even though Congress appropriate for the Department of Defense a certain amount, OMB does not automatically send them that funding. The agencies submit the SF-132 to Office of Management and Budget within 10 days, and then OMB has 30 days to issue their apportionment. And the agencies, DOD, submits allotments to its subordinate organization. So what we get from the Department of Defense is an allotment. And you'll hear that's the difference between appropriation, apportionment, and allotment. And once we get our funding, we commit, obligate, and we outlay funds. Remember, don't use disbursement, but it's the same thing as disbursement. The proper term for the CDFM is outlay. When the funds are removed from the Treasury to pay that obligation, it is an outlay. All right, I guess I should see if you have particular questions while we're going through. Feel free, if you're on the phone line, to ask your questions. If you're on the Facebook, go ahead and type in the comments, and I'll answer your questions later. All right, so we have various appropriations that we deal with primarily. There's MILPERS and O&M, 1-year expense type, RDT&E, procurement, shipbuilding, conversion, Navy, and Millicon, which are investment type. RDT&E is a 2-year appropriation. That means they're good for new contracts, new obligations. Procurement is a 3-year investment type. Shipbuilding, conversion, Navy is a procurement, but it's a 5-year appropriation type. And then you have military construction, which is a 5-year. So you have annual, multi-year, or you may have the working capital fund types, which are no year appropriation. They do not expire, but they still have restrictions on them. So every appropriation goes through 3 phases. Phase 1, current. Phase 2, expired. Phase 3, closed. What you need to know is what can you do with those funds when they are in phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. Phase 1, when it's current, you can enter into new contract. Once you get the approval documents, you can enter into new contracts all day. Upward, downward adjustments, make new contracts, new obligations. But once the appropriation, so if it's an RDT&E 2-year in current, once it enters the expired state, the only thing you can do is adjust contracts that were already in the system when those appropriations were current. So upward and downward adjustments. When an appropriation enters phase 3, canceled, closed, such as we're getting ready to close or cancel FY17 as of this video, once we come to 1 October of this year, we can no longer impact those funds. Those funds are automatically returned to the Treasury Department in the miscellaneous receipts account. However, if we do get a bill that comes and then it happens to be one of those closed accounts, so let's say 1 October, 1 November of this year, of FY22 or 2022, that we have a vendor that comes back and said, hey, I missed my cutoff, I didn't get the invoice in, can you pay this? You can, if you can use up to 1% of current appropriation. So if you have that same appropriation already in your system and you have enough to spare, yes, you can legally take 1% of current appropriation to pay on that closed account. But I'll make sure I annotate and get your hire to document the yes and so forth before you finalize it. Get some advanced decision. All right, so let's say I want to do a military construction project and it is $1 million. Do I have to have military construction dollars to do it? And the answer, if it's minor construction, the answer is no. I can use O&M up to $2 million for minor construction. So again, that means definition of what constitutes minor construction, but that's down the line. What if, let's see, I have a procured item that I need to buy, a system, and the system is greater than $250,000. Can I use O&M dollars to make that purchase? And the answer to that question is no. If you are procuring a system or an item and it's more than $250,000, you have to have procurement funding to do so. So you got to make sure you know those little ins and outs. All right. What is the difference between a project order and an Economy Act order? So think of the word a project. A project sounds huge. So this is how I learned the difference, right? Economy Act sounds like, okay, that's something that's beneficial, it's cheaper, easier. So when a project is done from a one DoD entity that's used to order work or services from another DoD entity, I can do business with another DoD entity because it's the same big pot, right? Apportionment, allotment, it all the DOD's funding. So at the end, I do not, if across the fiscal year, I do not have to worry about deobligating funds if it crosses fiscal year, because I'm doing a project with another DOD entity. Versus an Economy Act order, which is most of your MIPRs, Military Interdepartmental Request Forms. Those are Economy Act orders. That means it's any organization within the government is where you enter into an agreement. An order will be produced, a useful service or item. We must get something useful by the end of the fiscal year, and any unexpected portion that is not used must be deobligated. So you got to know the difference between a project. So that's the best way to remember. A project is with another DOD entity, so I do not have to deobligate funds at the end of the fiscal year. Economy Act is with intra-government, other government agencies outside of the Department of Defense. So if unused portion should be deobligated at the end of the fiscal year. So differences there. What is the goal of the working capital fund? So even though in module 2 it doesn't go into as much details as the other, I think module 3 talks about working capital fund also, is you need to know at least what's the goal of the working capital fund. So the company takes their money, they put the items on the shelf, buy the food, put the items on the shelf. They charge the customer based on how much it costs them to put the food on the shelf. The customer comes in, buys the food item, pays for it, and the money is then taken to then buy more food items to put on the shelf. Okay, that's what they do in the commercial side of the house. What is the difference between doing it on the commercial side versus the government side or the Department of Defense? Well, a working capital fund on the government side, the goal is to break even. They cannot continuously make a profit on the customers, us. So the goal of the working capital fund, although not stated in module 2, if you review module 3, you'll see the goal is to break even. And so in that revolving process, the prices that they charge has to also not just be based on how much it costs them to put it on the shelf. It's also got to be based on if you look back 5 years and they consistently have been earning a profit, then that is a trigger for them to lower the cost to the customer. And actually, I just found it. It's just not highlighted. Let me do that. The goal of the working capital fund is to break even, page 2.1.72 of your book. All right, so we covered all that. All right, non-appropriated funds. So some organization installations may receive NAF funds, non-appropriated. They don't get them directly from Congress, but they're able to charge customers for use of their facilities because they have the statutory authority to do so. You cannot just put up a business and start charging customers if you don't have the legal authority to do so. So most installations have the statutory authority for their MWR funding, and that has 3 categories. So category A is 100% appropriated. So they do receive some appropriation. If it's a category A, make sure you know what constitutes a category A. Usually it's morale, welfare, safety, aid, first aid, those type of things for the families. Category B, 65% appropriated, 35% NAF. And category C, your fishing, your hunting, 100% NAF fund. So based on the customers coming in, using those facilities, paying, and then you take that money to kind of revolve in that business. All right, so if I say that I give you some numbers, and I'm not going to do this because you have example 2181 for exercise 211. I advise you to review those and make sure you know what the word unapportioned, unallotted, unobligated, and so forth, what they mean. That goes back to the funding flow. Congress appropriates, OMB apportions, and DOD issues allotment. So if they say something is unapportioned, that means it's already appropriated, but that portion has not been apportioned. All right, so I'm going to leave that at that. So make sure, if you know the fund flow, appropriate, apportionment, allotment. Those are three words. That's the order they occur. Congress appropriate, OMB apportions, DOD issues allotment. So based on the flow, if they say it's unallotted, okay, that means only thing that happened to it, it's been apportioned. It hasn't been allotted yet. So don't let it confuse you. All right, so I'm going to do, so for those who may not be on my email distro, and so you're not getting the additional resources that I have slides, I have Word documents, sample questions, there's a lot of other tools that I have. So if you want those resources, feel free to leave a message on this video, and I will give you my email address, and you let me know where you want me to send those to. I try not to post them everywhere because it just kind of, after a while, it just kind of crowds all the information. So I wait on individuals who want the resources. So I do have handouts and other things outside of you having to sit here and listen to me go over this. So I want to go over so one of the slides that I have that I can send to you goes over 2.5. And what it does, okay, I gotta take off so I can switch gears. Let me put it in PowerPoint mode. So what it does is allows you to put the PowerPoint slide in slideshow mode, and I have the items coming in one at a time. So as you're studying, and once you get to the federal budget process, you're able to then click on the slide, and it should tell you, okay, this is what happens, and after this happens, then the next step. But you are going to have to fill in the gaps. I could not fill everything on this slide because then it'll get too busy anyway. So I just put the bare minimum, just enough to trigger your brain to start thinking of the next topic. So I'll walk through it. I don't have the capability here because I'm in the workplace. I don't have the capability to show you my screen, but hopefully in the future I'll figure something out. So if you need it, send it to me. So bottom line, the federal budget process begins understanding the operational chain of command runs from the president, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders. You have the president has the National Security Council, which is made up of president, vice president, SecDef, SecState, Secretary of Energy, Treasury, and advisors, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Director of Intelligence, and some additional. The final document that's created from the National Security Council is the National Security Strategy, the NSS document. That's the big op order. The Department of Defense takes the NSS document and creates the National Defense Strategy. Every 4 years, that National Defense Strategy used to be called the Quadrennial Defense Review, the 4-year document. Now it's the NDS. The DoD utilizes 3 Decision Support System, JSIDS, PPBE, Defense Acquisition System. JSIDS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, identify gaps in our capability. It is done by the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, who is chaired by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So he or she sits to tie in and review the .MLPF to review the warfighter capabilities that are needed to meet the National Defense Strategy. If they identify a capability gap, It is listed in an initial capabilities document to let everyone else know this is what we identify as the fix to the problem. When looking at the .mlpf, if it's anything other than a material solution, then it triggers the PPBE process. Determine how and when to pay for the resources to fill that capability gap. So the combatant commanders submit their integrated priority list. They send it to the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, senior military person, SecDef, and the military department that's going to be responsible for that item, the IPLs. So then the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff looks at the IPL and provide their assessment and recommendation to the Secretary of Defense. And so forth. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing. So I just wanted to show you, based on, once you get a copy of this one-page slide, and for those on my email distro, from the one I sent out earlier this morning, you should have this slide. It helps to guide your studies, and so you can review utilizing it. All right, so we went through all of this. All right, so let's talk about acquisition categories. ACAT, ACAT 1, ACAT 1A. Acquisition, major automated information systems, major DoD systems are your MDAP and your MAZE, major automated information, MAZE systems. Milestone Decision Authority, MDA, is that senior acquisition person, for whether it's a DoD level program or a component level program. How do you know the difference? If it's an ACAT 1 program, it tells you it's a major program, but if it has a D behind it, it tells you it's a DoD level program. An ACAT 1 Charlie program tells you it's a component level, and it's determined by dollar amount, by whatever criteria they're given. So your MDAP, Major Defense Acquisition Programs, are either ACAT 1 Delta or ACAT 1 Charlie. If it's an automation system, ACAT 1A, the A behind it telling you it's a major system, but it's an automated system, MIA. If it's an ACAT 1AM, the M is MAZE, Major Automated Information System, so it's telling you it's an DoD level program, right? And you have ACAT 1AC, it's a component automated information system. What you also want to know is who at that level is the senior acquisition person. And this is really a check on learning for acquisition category 1 Delta, because the senior acquisition person that we talked about in the beginning of this session today was the USD ANS, Acquisition and Sustainment. Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment is in charge of ACAT 1 Delta programs. He is the Defense Acquisition Executive, a different title. Just like you can be a commander, or you can be an executive officer, or you can have different titles on top of your rank and so forth, your position. ACAT 1AM, because we're talking automation system, understand that the USD ANS can delegate the DoD CIO to be in charge of the automation system. That's your Chief Information Officer. And the title for your Chief Information Officer for the DoD level is the USD R&E, Research and Engineer. So that's something new from the older study guides too. They designated CIO actual USD position. All right, so when they're doing these analysis and reviews of these programs, because you have to look at the total cost of a program, you need to start somewhere. So you need a baseline. So the program baseline is created by the program manager. And then you have to do cost analysis. So who is the senior cost analysis guy at the DoD level? That is DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So DCAPE again. So DCAPE is in charge of costs. DCAPE is in charge of the Future Year Defense Program. DCAPE was in charge of the programming phase of PEEB. And it was something else. And DCAPE is in charge of giving guidance on the analysis of the alternative in the Defense Acquisition Systems process. So remember, cradle to grave, we need a life cycle cost. All right, let's see where we're at today, because I don't want to go over. Yeah, all right. Also, another part where the DCAPE comes in is the DCAPE has a requirement when you're doing these major programs for a cost analysis requirements description document to be created, the CARD. So that one is also created or started by the program manager. It must be submitted. The draft is submitted 180 days from the overarching integrated product team, and the final is, 45 days before the OIPT. Because you have teams, you have boards, councils that meet to go over the data as you're moving through the process and the milestones. All right, so life cycle cost composition. All right, so what makes up a life cycle cost? You have several different costs. You have developmental costs. That's your RDT&E funding. Number 2, flyaway costs. That's how much it costs to buy the prime item. Weapon system costs. That's how much it costs to buy the main item and the support items. Procurement costs. That's everything associated with procurement dollars, to include the initial spares. Number 5, program acquisition costs. When you add your RDT&E, all your procurement, and all your MILCON for that project together, they all make up the program acquisition cost. So if you have to calculate the PAC, program acquisition costs, you add up those dollars. If you are asked to calculate the program acquisition unit cost, then depending on how many unit was created, then you take the total dollar amount divided by the unit, and it'll tell you how much it'll cost to develop one item. Yeah. So there are various cost estimates. Remember, you got to estimate cradle to grave. So there are various cost estimating methods. You have the POE, Program Office Estimate. So at the program manager level, and all program managers work for a program office. So program office estimate. Then once it gets up to the component, you have a component cost estimate. And then when it gets up to the DoD level, you have an independent cost estimate done by the DCAPE, right? So when in doubt and you see anything that say cost, pick DCAPE, right? Because they're all over this workbook. All right, other cost estimating methods: analogy, parametric, engineering, actual costs. Or let's see, analogy. So analogy is I could take the cost of, I have one similar item to what I'm trying to develop, so I can take that particular cost to develop that item as a starting point. Parametric says I have several systems that do similar things to what I need done, so I can take the different costs of how much for each of those systems. So I have several physical attributes of things. One vehicle may have up armor, the other one may have GPS. So if I use the cost to develop the up armored and the cost to develop the GPS, that's physical attributes that those systems have. So several similar physical attributes. Parametric. Engineering is saying I have nothing, I got to start from the bottom, I got to start over from scratch to come up with the cost. So it's time consuming, more expensive engineer, what is that? Also known as industrial engineering. So there aren't as much strength of using the engineering method. Actual costs mean we already have these vehicles already in the system. I just use how much it costs to develop those. These are just older system. I want some newer ones, so I gotta submit the request. Expert opinion, if you don't have any numbers to go with, you can get expert opinions on how much things cost. Then you use the Delphi technique. It's taking, if they all have the same response, chances are it might be a correct response. So you kind of use that technique. Usually you only use that if you have to respond to your hire in a quick second and you don't have a lot of time to do it. All right, so all that now is still 2.1, right? So it's still a lot of information. So all I'm doing is flipping the page if I see a topic and I want to talk about it, right? So this is a review. So let's talk learning curve. So learning curve says that the more that I do a job, my workload should double. That's the bottom line to it. The more you do a job over and over and over again, my output, what I produce, should be doubled. So the learning curve tells me what's the percentage. So a learning curve of the examples given, either they give you the unit 1, 2, 4, so you're always doubling, and the number of hours, and then they'll ask you, okay, well, how much hours do you anticipate it'll take to complete unit number 6? Let's say they only give you unit 1 and unit 2. Well, it'll be unit 8 actually, because you're doubling. So 4 and 4. So, and they only give you unit 1 and unit 2 data, and then they tell you, okay, how much hours will it take to produce unit 8? Then you have to go with the information that's given. So it's usually the number for unit 2 times the learning curve percentage. That'll tell you how much for the next double, which is unit 4, then from unit 4 to unit 8. Or if you're not given the learning curve percentage, they'll give you the units and the hours. And so if you divide, you will get the learning curve percentage. And the percentage should be same. So even if they have different lines, like they're trying to tell you it's a different percentage amount, it's not. You just know learning curve percentage is always the same. I don't know if I want to do this just yet. What time is it? 12:28. All right. I want to switch gears. All right. Tired of looking at this books. So part of my other study, I'm just going to run through some questions and responses. All right, which is the newest DoD armed services that we started off with this morning? That is the Space Force. Which act identified the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff as a senior ranking member of the armed forces? And that was in 1986, Goldwater-Nichols Act. Who is the principal military advisor to the President, the SecDef, and the National Security Council? Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Who is the chairman of the JROC and also is a vice chairman on the Defense Acquisition Board? That is the vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. What is the operational chain of command for combatant commanders? Operational chain of command runs from the President, the SecDef, to the combatant commanders. Which combatant commander submits a POM? Because if you remember when we went through the material, we said combatant commanders do not typically submit their own POM or budget requests. It goes through the military department or the service that handles that. However, you have the Special Operations Combatant Command that they are able to submit their own requirements. They do not have to go through the services. So that's one that we highlight. What is the name of the highest level strategy document in the U.S. government? That's a good way how to switch the question around. So you look at the words. What is the name of the highest level strategy document in the U.S. government? The big up order is the National Security Strategy. Who develops the NMS? First thing you should say, what is NMS? Oh, the National Military Strategy. Who develops it? I made sure I point that out, that the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff develops the National Military Strategy. Which guide? So from the National Military Strategy, which guide is developed? That is the Defense Planning Guidance, right? So it's all flowing. So once we get the National Security Strategy, the DoD produces the National Defense Strategy, and part of that is the National Military Strategy. Then we can go to the planning phase of PEB, Defense Planning Guidance, the DPG. Who creates an IPL, Integrated Priority List? Combatant commanders. You only see IPLs listed with your combatant commanders. They go as a package. Who is in charge of the budget execution of PEB? That is the USD Comptroller. Who conducts and coordinates the planning phase of PEB? That is the USD for Policy. Who is in charge of the programming phase of PEB? And let me go down the list. Who is in charge of the analysis of the alternative? Who is in charge of updating the future year defense program? And on and on. The DCAPE, Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. What is the final document of the planning phase of PEB? That is the Defense Planning Guidance. The face-to-face meeting between OSD personnel and Office of Management and Budget occurs when? During the fall review. What is the name of the system that is used to record all budget estimate submission? So part of the budgeting phase of PEB, there's a system that is used. What is the name of that system? Comptroller Information System. Which is the lowest level of detail in the president's budget? Ooh, that's a new one. Object classification. What is the most common type of obligating document? The most common type you have are contracts, or I'll say even MIPRs, right? Military Interdepartmental. Obligating documents. Under what title are project orders? Yep, because we went through the difference. So Title 41. If a contract officially defaults on the requirements of terms of a contract, can you terminate that contract? And how? Why? Yes, you can, due to termination under contract default. Contractor default. Yeah. What is the difference between a transfer of funds and a reprogram of funds? Reprogramming is a shift within the same, we are reprogramming within the same appropriation. You transfer out. When funds are shifted from one appropriation to another appropriation, that is a transfer.
This flow will allow you to adjust call recording behavior once this contact is connected to an agent. Note, any recordings will be stored in Amazon. Press 1
On your NAF, which category is 100% appropriated?
Press 3 to turn on customer only.
That is category, and I see that's incorrect. Category A, 100%. Made a mistake there. All right, what else? Who signs the
Specified.
initial capabilities document?
Hello, thanks for calling. These are some examples of what the Amazon Connect Virtual Contact Center can.
Okay. My phone is acting crazy. All right. Who signs the initial capabilities document? The Joint Chiefs of Staff. Because remember, JCIDs, they identify a capability gap, they put it in an initial capabilities document to notify who have all the milestone decision authority or on the PPBE side. So doing material solution analysis, what is the document called to plan for risk mitigation? Analysis of the alternative. All right, so I'm going to stop here for now with this study guide so I can make my changes, minimize that. All right, so does anyone have any question at this point? So I think we've covered enough for today, so we don't overload the process. All right, so if there are no questions on CDFM Module 2, Part 1 review of all the material, next week we will wrap up the review of CDFM Module 2 to ensure that we cover everything. With Module 2, it's repetition, repetition, repetition. You're going to get tired of hearing me saying it, but as you can see, there's a lot of information for you to be able to comprehend and be able to regurgitate it when it's time and you're asked questions. Because you're already going to be nervous when you take an exam, so you don't want the added pressure of not reviewing the material enough. So I want to stop here so you can walk away, review the material, and then come back again next week, and then I'll be able to finish up everything else. All right, if that's all for today, I thank you all for stopping by. If you have not already subscribed to our YouTube page, please consider subscribing to our YouTube page. This is Helen Thomas and the CDFM Study Group. I thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys again next time.